This week, we're reading Parshat Behar and Parshat Bechukotai. It is a double portion. Behar begins, V'yedaber Adonai el Moshe Behar Sinai. God spoke to Moses in Har mountain, in Har Sinai, Mount Sinai. Hence Behar. First distinctive word. When you enter the land, God says to speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when you enter the land that I assign you, the land shall observe a Sabbath to the Lord. 6 years you may plant your field, and 6 years you may prune your vineyard and gather in the yield. But in the 7th year, the land shall have a Sabbath of complete rest, a Sabbath of the Lord. You shall not plant your field or prune your vineyard. You shall not reap the aftergrowth of your harvest or gather the grapes of your untrimmed vines. It shall be a year of complete rest for the land. But you may eat whatever the land during its Sabbath will produce. You, your male and female slaves, the hired and bound laborers who live with you, and your cattle and the beasts in your land may eat all its yield. You shall count off 7 weeks of years. 7 times 7 years, so that the period of 7 weeks of years gives you a total of 49 years. Then you shall sound the shofar loud in the 7th month, on the 10th day of the month, Yom Kippur. You shall have the shofar sounded throughout your land, and you shall make the 50th year holy, and you shall proclaim liberty throughout the land for all its inhabitants. It shall be a jubilee for you. Each of you shall return to his holding, and each of you shall return to his family. The sabbatical and the jubilee. But first, let me note that we are in the 50-day count. That's a 50-year count. We're in the 50-day count, 7 weeks plus a day, a week of weeks plus a day until the Feast of Weeks, Shavuot. The 50-day count between Passover and Shavuot, counting the Omer. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al sfirat haomer. Blessed are you, Adonai, our God, ruler of the universe, who makes us holy with mitzvot and commands us to count the Omer. Today is the 37th day of the Omer. The 37th day of the Omer, making 5 weeks and 2 days. 5 weeks and 2 days of the Omer. Which also means that Tuesday was Lag BaOmer. Tuesday was the 33rd day of the Omer. Now, the Omer period is tinged with sadness. Traditionally, there are no weddings, no music, no haircuts. I always put off a haircut till after Lag BaOmer. I just haven't seen anyone yet to do it. Except Lag BaOmer. Lag BaOmer is the exception, the 33rd day. Why? Well, the legend is that Rabbi Akiva's students were afflicted with the plague. Therefore, we mourn. But on the 33rd day, the plague was lifted. So we do not mourn on Lag BaOmer, but we do all those things that we were not doing for the rest of the Omer: haircuts, weddings, music. It may seem that it's a lot to be doing for the remembrance of one plague. There have been many plagues in our history. One plague 2,000 years ago, Rabbi Akiva students, until we think about the fact that Rabbi Akiva was the spiritual inspiration or the spiritual leader of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. Maybe Bar Kokhba students were the Bar Kokhba fighters. Maybe the plague is Rome. You know, we don't actually know that much about why the period of the Omer is tinged with such sadness. But Lag BaOmer, as a result, is tinged with happiness. happiness in the midst of sadness, and bonfires. In Israel, very traditional, mostly ultra-Orthodox Jews gather in Meron, in the mountains of the Galilee, for a celebration. Tens of thousands. First, haircuts for 3-year-olds and bonfires. The fire represents the light of Torah that came into the world through the life of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. Shimon Bar Yochai was a 2nd century rabbi who was featured as the central character of the Chavraya, the fellowship, depicted in the Zohar, wrestling with the secrets of mystical intimacy. The Zohar, that vast literary compendium that is central to Kabbalistic tradition. Lag BaOmer is said to be the yortzeit of Shimon Bar Yochai, the Rashbi, who is said to be buried in Meron, in the mountains of the Galilee. So tens of thousands of people gather in Meron, where Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is buried, light bonfires to celebrate the light of Torah and rejoice. In Harrisburg this year, the local Hakel group also had a bonfire and a social gathering. My jacket still smells like smoke. What can I do? The Talmud describes that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, the Rashbi, during his lifetime, for a long period of time, had to hide from the Romans who wanted to execute him. So for 13 years, he had to hide in a cave along with his son. The Talmudic story is that God provided a carob tree to provide simple food and a spring to provide water. 13 years he was sequestered, like in a prison. Emotionally, he and his son survived by studying Torah. Perhaps this is where the deep Torah insights might be understood to come from. This aspect of Lag BaOmer, this confining aspect, at least, was something of relevance to inmates with whom I learn at the prison. Being confined to a cave for 13 years is something that they understand. At the prison this week on Lag BaOmer, I happened to be there on Lag BaOmer, we meditated a bit. It was a little more mystical than we usually do. I led this meditation simply using the words of the Shema. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. I led this also as a nod to the death last week of my late teacher, Rabbi Jonathan Omerman, a teacher of Jewish meditation and spiritual life first and foremost. Rabbi Omerman, my teacher, learned for 25 years in Israel with Jewish mystics. He was heir to that slender strand of Jewish mysticism that survived the Holocaust and ended up in Israel with a small cadre of surviving teachers and practitioners. Which is not to say he was of the old world. Mystics in particular are able to point towards truth that lie beneath the outward forms and categories. They may point out that practices are important in order to point towards meaning, but the practices themselves need not nor should not be venerated as the end-all or be-all. Jonathan Omerman once said to me that some Jews are so concerned with authenticity they lose their integrity. Some Jews are so concerned with authenticity, they lose their integrity. That is, they are so concerned with living like our ancestors who came before us that they commit themselves to living by ideals that they themselves do not consider to be truthful. What sense do we make of God as a commander, given the naturalistic ways that many of us may actually think about God? What then do we mean by mitzvah, by commandment? Rabbi Omerman once told me that he could envision a form of Judaism not built around the concept of brit, the concept of covenant. When I asked him if he would say more about that, all he would say was, think about it. I'm still thinking. He was a terse mystic. As we approach Shavuot, by the way, in 2 weeks, Shavuot, the Feast of Weeks, the end of the Omer, that is Zman Matan Toratenu, the time of the giving of our Torah. It is the time of Sinai. This is a good time to be thinking about covenant or not, and Torah. The last 3 or 4 decades of his life, Rabbi Omerman lived in California. California is a much more open space than Israel. Israel is geographically cramped and compact. Israel is also spiritually crowded and brittle, with so many different historical peoples and traditions rubbing up against each other. It is difficult to open up to a wider space of mind, to imagine things different. California is a much larger space, on the edge of a broad ocean, with many different peoples and newly arrived ways of being. Jonathan Omerman, it struck me, perhaps was striving for an edge of the West Judaism. Literally, California, geographically, kind of the edge of the West. You go much further, you're back in the East. Edge of the West Judaism, a Judaism perhaps that might exist in California, situated quite literally at the edge of the established Western world, and looking out over a broad expanse of open sea, more so than towards the institutional roots of Western civilization back towards the East. It struck me that edge of the West might also explain the spiritual ferment that happened 1,000 years ago in Spain, which then was also clearly the edge of the West, in the same place that California is now. Think of Spain before 1492. What happened in 1492? Someone tell me. 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Well, and also the Jews were expelled from Spain, and so were the Muslims. I mean, there's a whole bunch more. But until then, Spain is the edge of the world. Spain is the end of the world. What is it like to be in Spain at the end of the world? Many new forms, prayers and practices grew out of Jewish Spain. Jewish forms, prayers, practices grew out of Spain, even though, and perhaps because the major academies of tradition were elsewhere to the east. The first actual written Siddur, a Siddur arrangement of prayers, it's the Jewish community of Spain writing to Baghdad saying, please write out your prayers and send them to us so that we know what to say. Spain. Destruction is also part of this process. Like fire when it burns through some forest, opening up space for newer life to start again, which is not to say that we want to celebrate destruction. We don't. But when we experience destruction, this at least presents us with a way to respond. When Judaism in Spain was destroyed with the expulsion of 1492, within 60 years, new approaches to Jewish life emerged in other parts of the Spanish diaspora, now referred to as Lurianic mysticism. When the temple was destroyed in the year 70 by the Romans, ultimately rabbinic Judaism emerged. How that transition took place is an ongoing scholarly question of great spiritual importance to us today, however. The Dalai Lama has taken great interest in that question because the world of Tibetan Buddhism has experienced something similar. Their central temple in Tibet was lost to the Chinese in 1959, and they're still struggling to imagine how they can continue without it. That is one reason why the Dalai Lama invited a delegation of rabbis to meet with him 30 years ago, which became the subject of a book, The Jew and the Lotus, by Roger Kamenetz. And my teacher, Rabbi Jonathan Omerman, was part of that delegation described in the detail within this book. So were 3 other of my teachers. It's in a strange situation when you read about 8 rabbis and you know 4 of them. We have to wonder, what is coming out of now? What is coming out of now after the destruction of all the centers of Jewish life in the Holocaust in Europe, followed by the expulsions of Jewish communities from Arab lands. Jewish life, grounded in Jewish tradition, in a sense, was nearly wiped away. Only recently have adequate translations of Talmud and Zohar been completed into languages that Jews use today. Until now, these texts have not been available to most Jews for creative use. The Zohar in particular has only been fully and functionally translated into English within the past decade. So many of our texts are now universally available in ways they never were before, online at Safaria.com, founded in great part by one of C.J. Ford's cousins, Joshua Ford. Actually, we've got a little celebrity amongst us. How will all of these texts be utilized to build different Jewish ideas in the next 50 years? We can hardly know. This week's Torah portion speaks of attempts to establish openness in the midst of established structure. We read about the sabbatical year and then about the Jubilee year. Every 7 years, in a significant way, the standard socioeconomic order of things is opened up to allow for new growth to seed again. And then every 50 years, there's a Jubilee in which the socioeconomic order is overthrown and altogether reset to begin again. And the Torah says, "You shall proclaim liberty to all the land and all the inhabitants thereof." These words inscribed upon the Liberty Bell, placed in the mid-1700s atop the Pennsylvania State House, now known as Independence Hall. The word for liberty in the Torah, however, is dror. You shall proclaim dror throughout all the land and to all the inhabitants thereof. Dror more closely means release from servitude. You shall proclaim release from servitude. Perhaps a type of socioeconomic openness throughout the land that might also be felt within the hearts of all the inhabitants thereof. Perhaps this illustrates an attempt to capture an element of edge of the West Judaism within heart of the East Judaism. It's almost like a pre-programmed internal destruction, or if not destruction, a mandated breakdown in order to build up again. The early 20th century teacher, Rav Abraham Kook, is often quoted with the phrase, "The old shall be made new, and the new shall be made holy. The old shall be made new, and the new shall be made holy." In some sense, this idea is built into the teaching of this part of the Torah. The old shall be made new, and the new shall be made holy. But to do this, we need space and openness of mind and heart, and also of community structure. And yet also a commitment to making the old new, a commitment to making the old new and making the new holy. In other words, a commitment to find meaning in life and in tradition. Maybe more than that, an acknowledgement of the necessity to find meaning. When I introduced a moment of meditation to the prison, inmates I met with this past Lag BaOmer, I gave them a minimal amount of instruction and just launched into the meditation using the Shema as a mantra. I did not want to spend a lot of time on it, really, mostly because in the short time I meet with them, I want to be able to convey as much information as I can to them. I said to them afterwards that my thought has always been that meditation is something they can do on their own, in their cells, wherever they are, outside of the time we have together. To my great surprise, first of all, every one of them engaged in the meditation. They embraced it enthusiastically. And they said to me, "No, we cannot meditate in our cells. There is just too much commotion and tension. In a word, not enough openness." Over and over again, what I find is that in prison, we can see in a heightened way the need for spiritual practice that so many of us outside of prison neglect. But also we need spiritual practice grounded in structure, yet not trapped by that structure. We need edge of the West Judaism, which is grounded in heart of the East Judaism. We need to stand like we do with the Amidah, facing the ancient sites of Jerusalem, but aware that we are standing in the here and now. Building on the work of sociologist of religion, Peter Berger, it seems to me that there are only three types of religion in the contemporary world: Reform, Reconstructionist, and Restorationist. And I say that without any reference really to particular denominations. Reform religion is built on modern contemporary understanding. We acknowledge that our ancestors understood things differently, but that's not how we see things anymore. So we live out truth as we see it today, as a matter of personal integrity. On the other side is Restorationist religion. We see how our ancestors understood things, and we commit to the premise that even if things seem different to us today, we will live and think in the way our ancestors did, as a matter of authenticity. And yet a third approach, the Reconstructionist religion, we acknowledge that our ancestors understood things differently, and we see how we understand things today, and we're going to spend energy asking how our ancestors' perspective might critique the way we see things, and examining how what we see might critique what our ancestors thought and did. And we're going to have to come to terms with not ever being fully certain. So we will need a sense of openness that comes from standing outside of tradition, and a sense of commitment that comes from being part of tradition. We'll need to hold an attachment to the heart of the East, even as we acknowledge that we are living at the edge of the West. We seek what, as Reconstructionist Jews, to walk in the ways of Eloheinu ve'Elohei Avotenu, our God and the God of our ancestors, the God of our experience, and also the God of the tradition of our ancestors. And we acknowledge that it is an ongoing walk, an ongoing process. We don't know entirely where it is going, but to live this, we need to maintain an openness to the now, along with an eye to the past. I once heard Rabbi Ira Eisenstein quote his father-in-law, Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan, comparing this process to rowing a boat. You know how to row a boat? You know, you're rowing this way, you're facing backwards. You can't see the direction you're going. So you move forward, to maintain guidance, you find a fixed position over there, and you line yourself up with that position. You're not where everyone else was, but you're keeping track of where you once were. We're rowing in the present, moving forward, and in order to maintain our trajectory, we keep ourselves aligned with a point in the past. Borrowing words from Rabbi Jonathan Omerman, we maintain integrity with how we see the world, and we remain an authentic continuation of our tradition. This requires an openness of heart and mind, which perhaps meditation, Shabbat, the sabbatical years, and the Jubilee can help us sustain. Let us go from strength to strength as we do that. Let us say Shabbat Shalom. This is all falling off here. And we're going to read one verse at the end of Parshat Bechukotai, because Bechukotai is the end of Leviticus. And when we end a book, we say, strength, strength, and be strengthened. Chazak, chazak, v'ni chazek. So we'll rise. These are the commandments that Adonai gave Moses for the Israelite people on Mount Sinai. Elah hamitzvot asher tziva Adonai et Moshe el bnei Yisrael behar Sinai. Chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek. Shabbat shalom.